Welcome back to the U.S. Navy History Podcast. I am Dale, and I am joined by the XO, the guy who has my new hairstyle, Christoph.
Hey, no hair is back in, y'all. Thank you, Michael Jordan. Great to be here.
So, today we are going to talk about the Western theater of the American Revolutionary War. We're going to do the overview of the Western areas. Then, if we have time, we're going to hit the Northern theater after Saratoga.
Nice. Now, when I think Western theater, I just want to preface what you're about to jump into. West, I always think California, Arizona, that side of the now America. But Revolution was really all East Coast, and it was just the west side of those states, right?
This is west of the Appalachian Mountains. It's a region that became the Northwest Territory of the United States, as well as the states of Kentucky, Tennessee, and Missouri.
Okay, cool. Thank you for providing. You probably would have said that ahead of time, but I just want to get us oriented early. I mean, I want to get the listeners oriented early because I'm a kind guy.
Ah, okay. So, you ready to get underway?
Yes, sir. Let's do it.
All right. So, when the war begins in 1775, the Ohio River marked a border, very, loaded border between the American colonies and the American Indians of the Ohio country. This border was put in place in 1763 by a proclamation that forbade British colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains.
Oh, no kidding.
The British Crown issued the proclamation after the French and Indian War to help prevent conflict between the Native Americans and colonists in, the territory they just got from France.
Yes.
So settlers and land speculators in Britain and America, they objected to this.
Huh.
But, the British officials did negotiate two treaties with American Indians in 1768. This was the Treaty of Fort Stanwix and the Treaty of Hard Labor. This opened up land south of the Ohio River. And, after this, tensions between British officials and the colonists over Western land policy just started to go down, 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 down. Most of the Native Americans who actually lived and hunted in the Ohio Valley, these were the Shawnee, the Mingoes, the Delawares, and the Wyandots. These guys had not been consulted with the 1768 treaties.
Who was consulted? Does the history record that, or?
It was the Iroquois.
Okay. Well, I know they were part of like a multi-tribe nation of sorts, and so I can see the British Crown thinking, oh, you're kind of the big dog. You kind of speak for many tribes. But still, that's not all of them.
Actually, that was because of racism.
Oh, no kidding.
The British saw them all as one people, not as...
Oh, it wasn't as nuanced as I'm giving them credit for.
Exactly.
Okay.
They said, hey, you guys are, slur upon slur upon slur upon slur. So you're all the same. We're just going to deal with this one guy, and whatever he says goes.
Simpler times.
So the Iroquois are now number one in the hot seat with all these other tribes, for selling their land to the British. So the Shawnees begin to organize a confederacy of Western Native Americans with the intention of preventing the loss of these lands. The British and Iroquois officials worked to try to diplomatically isolate the Shawnee from the other Native American nations.
Okay.
So when the Dunmore's War broke out in 1774, the Shawnees faced the Virginia militia. And, Virginia, they win this. So this pretty much made the Shawnee accept the Ohio River boundary.
Okay.
Now, the Shawnee and Mingo leaders who did not agree with the terms, they renewed their struggle, I guess is the nice way of saying it, after the American Revolutionary War begins in 1775.
That's a good time to do that, I think.
Mm-hmm. So, initially, both the British and the Continental Congress sought to keep Western Native Americans out of the war. At Fort Pitt in October of 1775, American and Native American leaders reaffirmed the boundary established by the Dunmore's War the year before. But when the fighting starts, Native American leaders such as Chief Blackfish of the Shawnee and Pluggy of the Mingo, they started raiding into Kentucky. Their goal is to just drive them all out.
That makes sense also. I mean, just keep thinking about if somebody came to my neighbor and said, hey, do you mind if we move in next door, like to my house? And they're like, yeah, that's cool, but just don't come over here. They're like, great. And then all of a sudden some British troops are in my house. I'd be irritated.
Let's try it. Let's get some British troops in your house, see how you feel.
Well, thankfully, what is that, the Third Amendment? The quartering of troops not allowed, so I'm going to go ahead and stick with that.
Yeah, but those are going to be foreign troops now. That just counts for American troops.
I'm going to just make I'm going to say, look, y'all, I got rights, get out. And then I might have to back that up with something more than my get out. But we'll start there and see what happens.
All right, let's not escalate.
Yeah. we're going to be united. Just say, we're working together. Please leave. Oh, I'll serve them bad coffee and use the wrong fork. They'll be so insulted. They'll never want to see my face again. Ooh,
as soon as you put out coffee instead of tea, they're going to be insulted.
Oh, that's right. It doesn't even need to be bad. I would just be hurting myself at that point, so. Well, anyway, yeah. If it comes to that, I'll let you know. I'll update you and the listeners as to how I deal with the British troops.
Okay. So that's going to bring us to Governor Patrick Henry of Virginia. He wanted to retaliate by attacking Pluggy's town in the Ohio country. But he ended up canceling the expedition because he was afraid that the militia that he sends would not be able to distinguish between the Native Americans they were supposed to be fighting and the Native Americans they were not supposed to be fighting.
Yeah. We should have provided them uniforms, or the British should have. It's like, hey, can you have your guys wear this? And then they would know.
But it's not just pure racism. He actually didn't want to make enemies of the other tribes. So he was like,
that's smart.
Hey.
You don't want to do that.
But, the Shawnees and the Delawares, they have become increasingly divided over whether or not they're going to fight in the war. There are also leaders such as White Eyes of the Delaware tribe and Cornstalk of the Shawnee, who were like, no, we just need to be neutral. Let those white idiots go kill each other. We don't need to spill our own blood for them.
That's wise.
So there is also a guy named, and I'm probably going to butcher this, Buck-ongaluas of the Delaware tribe and Blue Jacket of the Shawnee. They decided to fight against the Americans. All right. In Kentucky, isolated settlers and hunters became the frequent targets of attacks, driving a lot of them back east. By late spring of 1776, fewer than 200 colonists remained in Kentucky.
Wow, that's very small, given that land size especially.
Yeah. They were primarily at the fortified settlements of Boonesboro, Harrodsburg, and Logan Station. In December of 1776, Pluggy of the Mingo tribe was killed in an attack on McClennan's station. And this was located on the site of present-day Georgetown.
Oh, wow.
So that's going to bring us to 1777. That is when the British launched a major offensive from Canada. This was to try to provide a strategic diversion for operations in the Northeast, and officials in Detroit began recruiting and arming Native American war parties to raid American settlements.
Well, hold on a second. So, I'm not familiar with the history of Detroit. I know Michigan was not one of the original 13 colonies. Was Detroit a French settlement, an English settlement? Like, what? Where does it... I didn't even know that city was there during the Revolutionary War period. And so it's surprising that you're mentioning that they're recruiting from this place.
It wasn't part of the original 13 colonies, but it was still under British control.
Okay.
They got it from the French in 1760.
That makes sense.
Good?
Yeah, I'm on board now. Thank you. Continue with your major British offensive.
Okay. So, we don't know how many Americans were present in Kentucky, West Virginia, Pennsylvania who were killed in these raids. But the intensity of the conflict increased after American militiamen murdered Cornstalk,
Ooh.
who was the leading advocate of Shawnee neutrality.
That seems like a bad idea. I know.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's
I
this
agree.
one.
Why kill the person that wants everybody to be nice and live together and be happy?
Yeah, I don't know.
But despite the violence, many Ohio Native Americans still hoped to stay out of the war. But this was hard because they were located directly between the British in Detroit and the Americans along the Ohio River. So, they're caught between two opposing forces.
That's a bad place to be.
Yeah. So the Virginians had attempted to defend their western border with militiamen garrisoning 3 forts along the Ohio River: Fort Pitt, Fort Henry, and Fort Randolph. But defending this long border proved to be pretty futile because the Native Americans simply bypassed the forts during their raids.
Yeah.
So in 1778, the Americans had a bright idea. They said, well, we need to go on the offensive because that's the only way we're going to secure our western border. So the first American expedition into the Ohio country was, to be blunt, a complete and utter cluster.
No kidding.
In February of 1778, General Edward Hand led 500 Pennsylvania militiamen from Fort Pitt on a surprise winter march towards Mingo towns on the Geauga River, where the British stored military supplies, which they distributed to the Native American raiding parties. The weather prevented the expedition from reaching its objective. And on the return march, some of Hand's men attacked peaceful Delaware Native Americans, killing 1 man and a few women and children.
Oh my gosh.
Including relatives of the Delaware chief, Captain Pipe. So, because only non-combatants had been killed, the expedition became known as the quote-unquote Squaw Campaign.
That's embarrassing. I mean,
That's very embarrassing.
but I'm glad, I mean, as embarrassing as it is, I think it's important to acknowledge and be aware of the actual history that our country was a part of.
Yeah, it's ugly, isn't it?
Well, that event certainly is. I know there are some that only focus on events like that and some that only focus on the stellar heights that we've reached. And it's like, look, it's a mixed bag.
Mm-hmm.
Just accept that and try to learn from the past so we don't keep screwing up.
Yeah. So, to add to Hand's problems, other than his unruly militia, the loyalist sentiment around Pittsburgh was not helping him. In March of 1778, 3 men with close ties to the British and Native Americans left Pittsburgh, defecting to the British and Native American side. These guys were Simon Girty, who was an interpreter who had guided the quote-unquote Squaw Campaign, Matthew Elliott, who was a local trader, and Alexander McKee, who was an agent for the British Indian Department.
Oh my. That's a lot of
All
specialties.
Yeah, all 3 of these guys would prove to be very valuable to British operatives in the war.
Oh, yeah.
So Hand faced a congressional investigation for allowing these guys to defect. And he ended up resigning in May of 1778.
So let me ask you a question as of the two of us, the military expert, I would say. Yes. How can you disallow somebody from defecting? Like they're holding the officer responsible, and it seems to make sense on the surface, but if they want to defect, what is it, just like monitoring them more closely, or how does one do that?
More than likely. I mean, I wasn't there.
Right.
I don't have the court transcripts either, or any of the investigation transcripts. But if he resigned. So if he resigned to keep from getting charged with it, which usually is why people resign.
Right.
More than likely there was evidence saying that he knew that this was a possibility.
Okay.
So instead of keeping tabs on him or even just arresting them to keep it from happening. But again, this is just
hypothetical, I understand.
Yeah.
The whole concept seems like I couldn't think of a way that you could be responsible, I guess, unless if you did have the information and you weren't proactive on it. That does make sense. Okay. Well, I'll assume for as I'm listening to the story, that's probably what happened, but it's not 100%.
There's also another thing. As the commander, he is responsible for anything that happens under his command as well. So
yeah,
there's that could be a reason as well.
Okay. Thanks. I appreciate that. Carry on, sir.
You're welcome. So, following the escalation in 1777, Americans on the western frontier appealed to the Continental Congress for protection. After an investigation, they recommended in early 1778 that 2 regiments of the Continental Army be stationed in the West. And they also said because a defensive line of forts had little effect on the Native American raids into the American settlements, they called for a fort to be built on the Native American side of the Ohio River. This was the first in a line of forts which would enable the Americans, they hoped, to mount an expedition against Detroit. So the Holidays Cove Fort was a fortification constructed in 1774 by soldiers from Fort Pitt. It was located in what is now downtown Weirton, West Virginia, along Harmons Creek. about 3 miles from its mouth on the Ohio River. It was commanded by Colonel Andrew von Swearington, and then later by his son-in-law, Captain Samuel Brady. He was the famous leader of Brady's Rangers.
Oh, okay.
So in 1779, over 28 militia was garrisoned there at Holliday's Cove. Let's see. Colonel Van Swearington, he led a dozen soldiers by longboat down the Ohio River to help rescue the inhabitants of Fort Henry in Wheeling when they were under siege by British and Native American tribes. That mission was memorialized in a WPA-era mural painting on the wall of the Cove Post Office by Charles S. Chapman.
That's cool.
The mural features Colonel John Bilderback, who later gained infamy as a leader of the massacre of the Moravian Indians in Gundenhutton in 1782. So in order to build a fort in the Ohio country, the Americans actually tried to get the approval of the Delaware Indians. In September of 1778, they negotiated the Treaty of Fort Pitt with the Delawares, which resulted in the building of Fort Lawrence along the Tuscarawas River. But good plans went awry.
Oh, no.
White Eyes, who was the Delaware leader, had negotiated the treaty, apparently was murdered by an American militiaman.
I'm starting to see a pattern, and I don't like it.
His rival, Captain Pipe, eventually abandoned the American alliance and moved west to the Sandusky River, where he began receiving support from the British in Detroit. Also, because of intense warfare in eastern Pennsylvania and upstate New York, Congress was not able to provide the manpower for operations against Detroit. So this new fort was abandoned in 1779. George Rogers Clark, a young Virginia militia officer, launched a campaign to seize a garrisoned Illinois country from the British with a company of volunteers. Clark captured Kaskaskia. He was the chief post in the Illinois country on July 4th, 1778, and then later secured the submission of the Vincennes. The Vincennes were then recaptured by General Henry Hamilton, who was the British commander at Detroit. In February of 1779, Clark marched to Vincennes in a surprise winter march and captured Hamilton himself.
Wow.
To the American frontiersmen, Hamilton was known as, quote, the hair buyer general, because they believed he encouraged the Native Americans to kill and scalp American civilians.
Ooh.
So because of this, Governor Thomas Jefferson,
Oh.
I don't know if you've heard of him.
Yeah, good old TJ.
Well, he brought Hamilton to Williamsburg, Virginia to be tried as a war criminal. Now,
That's
the
appropriate.
Now, British officials did threaten to retaliate against American prisoners of war. So Jefferson, he's like, all right, we'll exchange him for one of our guys, okay? Is that good?
I guess you got to do what you got to do in wartime, but, I mean, that a-hole was trying to get scalps from American civilians. That seems pretty rude, at least. And
Well, that's what we believe. There's no evidence that I know of, at least.
Okay. That's hair buyer, the chief hair buyer. I mean, if it's hair, H-A-R-E, like rabbits, yeah, okay, different. But I don't think that's what you were saying. And I think that's, of civilians, that's terrible.
So, over the next several years, both sides launched raids against each other, usually targeting settlements. In 1780, hundreds of Kentucky settlers were killed or captured in a British Native American expedition into Kentucky. George Rogers Clark responded by leading an expedition in August of 1780, which destroyed 2 Shawnee towns along the Mad River, but really didn't do much damage to the war effort. In late May, Spanish-held St. Louis was attacked by a British force, mostly made up of Native Americans, and was successfully defended by the mixed Spanish and French Creole force.
Oh, wow.
Fort San Carlos, a stone tower in the modern downtown St. Louis, was the center of the defense.
I had no idea.
In the Illinois Territory, French officer Augustin de la Baume assembled a militia force of French residents in an effort to take Fort Detroit. The force was destroyed in November by the Miami under Chief Little Turtle. But at the same time, the nearly abandoned Fort St. Joseph was raided by Americans from Cahokia. But on their return trip, they were overtaken by British loyalists and Native Americans near Petit Fort.
I know this is an aside, but that's what I'm known for, so here we go.
I sided up.
I'm siding it up. You reminded me there is a Native American tribe called, I don't know how to pronounce it. It could be Cahokia. I always thought it was Cahokia, but I don't know if there's just a difference in... Anyway, on the UNESCO list of preservation sites of like historically significant things around the world, there are these mounds that were created by this tribe, if it's the same tribe that I'm thinking, that are significant. And they are, I want to say, in the area you're describing. And you can go visit them today. And I don't know if they know exactly what they were used for, but they're significant. They're called the either Cahokia or Cahokia Mounds. Check them out.
Absolutely. That sounds like good old time. Definitely better time than what we're describing now.
Oh, yeah. War sucks. That's what I'm learning in every episode. It's like, this is awful. But yeah, let's look on the brighter side of things and see what historical and cultural achievements different peoples have made. So, there we go. Okay, back to the carnage. Go ahead.
Okay. So, Spanish Governor Francisco Kretz in St. Louis sent a force of about 140 Spanish soldiers and Native Americans under Captain Eugeo Poré to capture Fort St. Joseph. It was captured and plundered February 12th, 1781. In late 1780, Clark traveled east to talk with Mr. TJ, your best friend.
Oh, yeah. Me and him go way back.
He wanted to talk to him about an expedition in 1781. Jefferson devised a plan which called for Clark to lead 2,000 men against Detroit. Now, recruiting these men was a problem, because in a time of war, most militiamen prefer to stay close to their homes rather than go on a extended campaign.
Makes sense.
Also, Colonel Daniel Brodhead refused to detach the men because he was staging his own expedition against the Delawares, who had recently entered the war officially. Brodhead marched into the Ohio country and destroyed the Delaware Indian capital of Coshocton in April 1781. And this really ticked them off. This also deprived Clark of badly needed men and supplies for his Detroit campaign. And most of the Delawares then fled to the militant towns on the Sandusky River. Now, when Clark finally leaves Fort Pitt in August of 1781, he was accompanied by only 400 men.
Oh, man, that's not a lot.
No. Not even close to the 2,000 he wanted.
Oh, no.
On August 24th of 1781, a detachment of 100 of his men was ambushed near the Ohio River by Native Americans led by Joseph Brant, who was a Mohawk leader temporarily in the West. Brant's victory ended Clark's effort to move against Detroit.
Wow.
Well, I mean, he just lost a quarter of his
Yeah. No, for
strength.
sure. I think the Mohawk were part of the Iroquois Nation, or the Five Nations, so it's interesting.
So, between the combatants on the Sandusky River and the Americans at Fort Pitt were a number of villages of Christian Delawares. The villages were administered by the Moravian missionaries, David Zeisberger and John Hackenwelder. Now, these guys were non-combatants, but the missionaries favored the American cause and kept American officials at Fort Pitt informed about hostile British and Native American activity. So because of this, in September of 1781, Wyandots and Delawares from Sandusky forcibly removed the Christian Delawares and the missionaries to a new village called Captive Town on the Sandusky River.
What did they do there in Captive Town?
They were captive?
Oh! That explains the very on-the-nose name.
All right. So, in March of 1782, 160 Pennsylvania militiamen under Lieutenant Colonel David Williamson rode into the Ohio country. They had hoped to find the Native American warriors who were responsible for ongoing raids against Pennsylvania settlers. They were very, very angry about a gruesome murder by Native Americans of a white woman and her baby. So Williamson's men detained about 100 Christian Delawares at the village of Gundenhutton, and these Christian Delawares had actually returned there from Captive Town in order to harvest the crops that they had been forced to leave behind. So at least the British were nice enough to let them do that.
Yeah, I'll say.
Now, this was unlucky for them, though, because Williamson accused the Christian Native Americans of having aided the Native Americans raiding parties. The Pennsylvanians killed the 100 Christian Native Americans.
No.
Mostly women and children with a hammer.
That's not great, America.
No, it is not.
So they were angry about a gruesome murder of a woman and her child?
Mm-hmm.
And so they respond
By the gruesome murder of 100 women and children.
All right, well, that is part of history. Thank you for reporting on part of the conflict. I'm... Ooh. Go ahead, continue.
You look like you need a drink.
I do. This is awful. I mean, I understand that the colonies at this time were a very different place, and the social dynamics were very different. And my U.S. history teacher in high school said, you can never judge the morality of people in the past by current standards. But I never agreed with that. I'm like, I know they've got pressures. I know they've got difficulties. I cannot imagine killing 100 women and children with a hammer is ever the right call.
Right. Just because it was a different time with different standards still does not make it right.
Right. I'm sure there were sermons on this at the time. They're like, maybe we shouldn't do this. I hope. But anyway, let's keep going. Maybe we'll find some smaller travesties.
Probably not in 1782, which was called the Year of Blood.
Oh.
Yeah. But let's continue.
Yeah, let's see what happens. Maybe it's like Blood Brothers, like, hey, we're now close. No? You're shaking your head. Okay. Well, I'll let you keep talking. We'll see. Hopefully, my undying optimism has got to pay off sometime.
So, a guy named Colonel William Crawford of the Continental Army, he comes out of retirement to lead 480 volunteer militiamen, mostly from Pennsylvania, deep into Native American territory, with the intention of surprising the Native Americans. So, them and their British allies from Detroit had learned about this expedition in advance. And they bring about 440 men to the Sandusky to oppose Colonel William Crawford. After a day of pretty even fighting, the Americans found themselves surrounded, and they were like, we gotta get the heck out of here. And this retreat turns into a rout.
Oh.
Now, most of the Americans do manage to find their way back to Pennsylvania. About 70 Americans are killed, and the Native American and British losses were pretty much minimal. That's how it's described, as minimal.
All right.
So, during the retreat, Colonel Crawford and some of his men, we don't know how many, they are captured. The Native Americans executed many of these captured men in retaliation for the Guten-Hutton massacre earlier in the year. Crawford's execution was particularly brutal. He was tortured for at least 2 hours before being burned at the stake.
Oh.
Now, the failure of this expedition caused an alarm to go off along the American frontier, because a lot of these people feared that the Native Americans would be emboldened by this victory and launch a new series of raids. On July 13th of 1782, the Mingo leader, Gayasta, led about 100 Native Americans and several British volunteers into Pennsylvania, destroying Hannah's town and killing 9 and capturing 12 settlers. It was the hardest blow dealt by Native Americans in western Pennsylvania during the war. So let's go over to Kentucky. This is where the Americans went on the defensive, while Caldwell, Elliott, and McKee, with their Native American allies, prepared a major offensive.
And these are the 3 defectors from before, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Fort Estill was attacked by Wyandot Indians in March of 1782. And Colonel Benjamin Logan, commanding officer of the region, was stationed at Logan Station. He learns that the Wyandot warriors were in the area on a war path. Native Americans, aided by the British in Detroit, had raided from Boonesboro past Estill Station along the Kentucky River. And so Logan dispatches 15 men to Captain Estill at Estill Station with orders to increase his force by 25 more men and to start reconnoitering the country to the north and the east. So following the orders, Captain Estill reaches the Kentucky River a few miles below the mouth of Station Camp Creek, and that's where he camps for the night at Sweet Lick. On the day after they leave the station, a body of a number of Native Americans appeared at dawn and raided the fort. They scalped and killed a woman named Miss Ines inside of the fortification and took Monk, who was a slave of Captain Estill, captive. And they also killed all the cattle. As soon as the Native Americans retreated, Samuel South and Peter Hackett, both, really young men, pretty much boys, were told to go to the Downing Creek, Red River area to let those guys know of the raid that had just happened. Miss Ines getting scalped right in front of everybody.
Ugh.
And so they find them, and of these 40 men, about half of them had left families at the fort. So they were like, yeah, we need to go home. So the guys with families, they go back to the station, and the others, they cross the Kentucky River, and they find the trail of those raiders. So Captain Estill organizes a company of 25 men, and they follow the Native Americans. And they suffer what is now known as Estill's defeat, a.k.a. the Battle of Little Mountain in Montgomery County.
Yeah, this year of blood is turning out to be pretty, I guess, relevant to the namesake. This is... Yeesh.
Yeah. In July of 1782, more than 1,000 Native Americans gathered, but the expedition was called off after scouts reported that George Rogers Clark was preparing to invade the Ohio country from Kentucky. The reports were false, but Caldwell still managed to lead 300 Native Americans into Kentucky and deliver a devastating blow at the Battle of Blue Licks in August. Now, at this time, peace negotiations between the United States and Great Britain were starting to make some progress. So Caldwell was ordered to pretty much just stop and wait. General Irvine had also gotten permission for a Continental Army expedition into the Ohio country, but this was also canceled. Because there's peace, maybe, hopefully, sometime soon.
I hope. I guess well, spoiler alert. It's been over 200 years, so we know what happens, but I'm on the edge of my seat anyway.
In November, George Rogers Clark delivered the final blow in the Ohio country, destroying several Shawnee towns. Thankfully, not on the people themselves.
Well, I guess with everything we've heard this episode, that's a plus.
Yeah.
Just property damage.
Yeah. So, the war in the Northeast, in the words of a historian named David Curtis Skaggs, quote, ended in a stalemate. In the final years, each side could only destroy enemy settlements, but they could not stay and hold the territory. But for the Shawnees, the war was a loss.
Oh, yeah.
The Americans had successfully defended Kentucky and increased their settlements there. So their prime hunting ground is now gone. They had been pushed back from the Ohio River and were now settled primarily in the Lake Erie Basin.
Oh, okay.
The final treaty in the Ohio country was signed away by Great Britain to the United States. Even though, quote, not a single American soldier was north of the Ohio River when the treaty was signed. Great Britain had not consulted the Native Americans in the peace process, and the Native Americans were nowhere mentioned in treaty's terms. So, of course, for the Native Americans, as we know, the struggle would continue with the Northwest Indian War.
Yeah.
Though this time, without the British support.
Ooh, that's tough.
Yeah. So that is the Western Theater.
That was not great.
No.
But it's interesting. I mean, everything you mentioned, everything was new for me. Nothing I've read in the history books indicated any of this, with the exception of Britain kind of ignoring, or I guess both Britain and America ignoring the Native Americans when it came to dealing with peace. I mean, they involved them. It's like, hey, come help us. And some of them would help. And then it's like, yeah, but we're not going to include you in peace deals. It's just, I don't know. That stinks.
All right, so we are going to honor one of our fallen angels with the help of HeroCards.us. Today we are going to honor Major Paul Clark Volke. He's from Monroe, New York. He served with the U.S. Army, 1st Battalion, 30th Infantry Regiment, 2nd Heavy Brigade Combat Team, 3rd Infantry Division. He received the Bronze Star with 2 Oak Leaf Clusters, Meritorious Service Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster, Joint Service Commendation Medal. His date of sacrifice was June 22nd, 2012 in Mazar-e-Sharif, Afghanistan. He was 36 years old. Growing up in the small town of Monroe in New York's Hudson Valley, Paul Volke knew what he wanted to do. At an early age, he chose the life of a soldier. Friends interviewed Monroe's local newspaper, the Photo News, saying that he had his sights set on the West Point for as long as anyone can remember. Volke graduated from Monroe Woodbury High School in 1994. There he excelled as a student, played baseball, ran in cross country and track, and was part of the National Honor Society. He was a huge sports fan and followed the New York Knicks, New York Giants, and the Los Angeles Dodgers, formerly Brooklyn. His academic achievements to service to others was noticed, and his goal was realized when he earned an appointment to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. Volke was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Army. 2 years later, Volke married his high school sweetheart, Tracy, in 2000. The two would later welcome sons Andrew and Benjamin. Rising to the rank of captain, Volke was selected for a Joint Chiefs of Staff internship in Washington, D.C. There he studied policy management at Georgetown University, graduating with a master's degree in 2007. Volke was raised to the rank of captain, and his military career would include 5 deployments overseas, 1 in Kosovo, 2 in Iraq, and 2 in Afghanistan. For Veterans Day in 2009, Major Volke wrote a guest editorial entitled "Why I Serve Veterans Day Observances" for Southeastern New York's Times-Herald Record. It read, in part, "In the past 11 years, the Army has sent me to a variety of places, at home and abroad. There have been cold places and hot places, urban areas and rural. There have been places where I've enforced a peace, and places where I've been at war. I've met with village elders, teachers, engineers, sheiks, town council members, police officers, and imams. In each case, all of these places, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Kosovo, my mission had been to help people, to help them live their lives just like Americans want to live their life, in peace, and be able to provide for their families. They only want to send their children to school and live with electricity, clean running water, functioning sewers, and safe roads and markets. My role has been to help them achieve that, to live the Iraqi, the Afghan, the Kosovar dream. My job had been to provide the security, to protect the citizens of these countries, so the other things can happen." In February 2012, Major Volke was sent to Mazar-e-Sharif, Afghanistan, with the 1st Battalion, 30th Infantry Regiment, 2nd Heavy Brigade Combat Team, 3rd Infantry Division, out of Fort Stewart, Georgia. The 9-month deployment was in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. Serving his country and the Afghan people in the Mazar-e-Sharif on June 22, 2012, Major Volke suffered fatal injuries from an accident involving a mine-protected vehicle. He was lost at age 36 and had been married to Tina for 12 years. Sons AJ and Benjamin were just 6 and 8 years old, respectively, when their father gave the last full measure of devotion to his country. Major Paul Clark Volke, who as a child had his sights set on West Point, was laid to rest with his fellow soldiers at the United States Military Academy Post Cemetery, Section 34, Row AA, Site 2, on July 6, 2012. 2010, Major Volke's West Point class of 1998 established the 98 Fund, a non-profit organization that honors classmates who lost their lives, operating under the class motto, Duty Will Not Wait. The mission of the 98 Fund is to serve, connect, and provide healing support for veterans, survivors, and veteran organizations. Paul's wife Tracy has served on the organization's board of directors. So, Major Paul Clark Volke, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Christoph the XO, take us out.
Yes, sir. So, first of all, listeners, thank you so much for listening. We would still talk to each other, Dale and I, but it'd be very lonely. So we're glad you're along. And if you want to get in touch with us, there's a couple ways to do that. You can email us, first and foremost, at usnavyhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also tweet at us on Twitter. Yes, it's still Twitter in my mind. Our handle is at US Navy History Pod. Man, I'm sorry. I'm being shown a spectacular hat, and it's very distracting. But I'm going to push through because I care about you, listener, and I want you to be able to know that you have options. Feel free to rate us on your favorite audio platform or on YouTube. We're also on there. You can rate us. We read those, and we appreciate honest feedback. Preferably 5 stars. That would be great. We have a Discord channel. You can join that as well. Details for that are in the show notes. Beyond that, I'm just grateful to do this with everybody out there. So thanks again, and back to you, Dale.
All that's left is to wish everybody a fair wind and following seas. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.